Most people think that the Roman Empire was built inside the marble palaces that house the various emperors and the many Roman senators. What most people don't realize, however, is that the empire was forged in places thousands of miles from Rome. These places were the dark and muddy battlefields where the clash of steel determined the fate of millions. Every battle birthed new parts of the Roman Empire, and the armies fought like hell to expand the glory of their eternal city. Settle in, because I'm about to take you through 5 pivotal battles where the destiny of the greatest empire the world has ever known was decided not by politics or diplomacy, but by raw military might and strategic brilliance. These aren't just ordinary battles, though. These 5 battles were the turning points that shaped 2,000 years of history, creating the world we live in today. From the forests of Germany to the coasts of Egypt, from the hills of Gaul to the plains of Italy, these 5 conflicts defined not just Rome's borders, but its very soul. Some would forge an empire, others would nearly destroy it, but all would leave their mark on the ancient world forever. Welcome to the top 5 battles that defined the Roman Empire. Before we begin, hit the like and subscribe buttons now. That way you'll never miss another episode of Ancient Rome Revisited. Thanks for subscribing. Now let the battles begin. 1. The Battle of Alesia, 52 BCE, the birth of imperial ambition. Let me start with a battle that didn't just expand Rome's borders. It created the template for how Rome would conquer the world for the next 5 centuries. Picture this. It's 52 BCE, and Julius Caesar is facing the biggest challenge of his career. He's not fighting some barbarian rabble, but a united Gallic confederation led by a charismatic warrior king named Vercingetorix. Think of Vercingetorix as the ancient world's version of William Wallace, a freedom fighter trying to unite his people against foreign occupation. The Gauls had finally learned that fighting Romans in open battle was like bringing a knife to a tank fight. So Vercingetorix did something brilliant. He adopted a scorched earth policy, burning their own towns and supplies to deny them to the Romans. He retreated to the hilltop fortress of Alesia, a place so well defended it was like the ancient world's version of a mountain stronghold. The walls were massive, the position was nearly unassailable, and Vercingetorix had 80,000 warriors inside. But here's where Caesar proved he wasn't just another Roman general. He was a military genius who thought like a chess master, always 3 moves ahead. Instead of trying to storm those walls and lose thousands of men, Caesar did something that still makes military historians shake their heads in amazement. He built not 1, but 2 sets of walls around Alesia. The inner wall, called the circumvallation, trapped the Gauls inside. The outer wall, the contravallation, protected his army from relief forces coming to help. Imagine the engineering challenge here. Caesar's legions, working with nothing but hand tools and Roman ingenuity, built 11 miles of fortifications in just 3 weeks. They dug trenches, built wooden spikes, and created what was essentially a fortress designed to besiege a fortress. It was like building a prison around a castle, while simultaneously building another prison around yourself. The siege lasted for months, and it became a brutal waiting game. Inside Alesia, people were starving. Vercingetorix made the horrible decision to expel the women, children, and elderly from the fortress, hoping Caesar would feed them. Caesar refused, and these innocent people died in the no-man's land between the walls, a grim reminder of warfare's cruel reality. Then came the moment of truth. A massive Gallic relief army, 250,000 strong, arrived to break the siege. Caesar now faced enemies on 2 fronts, Vercingetorix's forces inside Alesia trying to break out, and 250,000 Gauls outside trying to break in. It was like being caught in the world's deadliest sandwich. The final battle was chaos incarnate. Caesar's outnumbered legions fought on multiple fronts simultaneously. The Roman lines bent but didn't break. At the crucial moment, Caesar personally led a cavalry charge that smashed into the Gallic relief army's rear. Seeing their commander in his distinctive red cloak fighting alongside them, the legions found new strength. The relief army scattered, and inside Alesia, Vercingetorix knew the game was over. In one of history's most dramatic surrenders, Vercingetorix rode out of Alesia in his finest armor and threw his weapons at Caesar's feet. The last great Gallic resistance was over, and Rome had gained what would become modern-day France, Belgium, and parts of Germany and Switzerland. But Alesia was more than just a territorial conquest. It created Julius Caesar, the legend. The wealth from Gaul made him rich beyond measure, and his military reputation made him untouchable. More importantly, it established the Roman template for conquest, methodical engineering-based warfare that could overcome any natural advantage. This wasn't just about brave soldiers charging with swords. This was industrial-scale warfare that could reshape geography itself. Caesar's success at Alesia set him on a collision course with the Roman Senate and his former ally Pompey. The riches and glory from Gaul made him too powerful to remain a mere general, but too dangerous to be allowed to return to civilian life. This tension would lead directly to our next defining battle, where the fate of the Roman Republic itself would be decided. Battle 2, the Battle of Actium, 31 BCE, the end of the Republic. Fast forward 20 years from Alesia, and Caesar is dead, assassinated on the Ides of March by senators who thought they were saving the Republic. Instead, they doomed it. The Roman world erupted into civil war, and eventually 3 men emerged to divide the spoils: Octavian, Caesar's heir; Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general; and Lepidus, who frankly wasn't important enough to warrant much attention in our story. By 31 BCE, the fragile alliance between Octavian and Antony had completely collapsed. Antony had made what Romans saw as the ultimate betrayal. He'd fallen in love with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, and seemed more interested in building an Eastern empire than serving Roman interests. To conservative Romans, this wasn't just personal scandal, it was cultural treason. Imagine if a presidential candidate today openly announced they were planning to move to Beijing and rule America from there. That's how Romans saw Antony's romance with Cleopatra. The showdown came at Actium, off the western coast of Greece. This wasn't going to be fought in muddy fields with swords and shields. This was a naval battle that would determine whether Rome remained Roman or became something entirely new. Antony's fleet was impressive on paper, 500 ships including massive kinkarems that were like ancient aircraft carriers. These ships had bronze rams designed to punch holes in enemy hulls, and they were packed with archers, marines, and siege weapons. Antony also had Cleopatra's Egyptian fleet, bringing exotic tactics and experienced crews who'd been fighting in the Mediterranean for generations. But Octavian had something better than big ships. He had Marcus Agrippa, possibly the most underrated military commander in Roman history. If Octavian was the politician and Caesar was the charismatic general, Agrippa was the quiet professional who actually knew how to win battles. Agrippa's ships were smaller and faster, designed for ramming and boarding actions rather than missile exchanges. On September 2nd, 31 BCE, the two fleets finally clashed. The battle began with the usual naval tactics, ships ramming each other while marines fought desperate boarding actions. But something strange happened. In the middle of the fight, Cleopatra's squadron suddenly broke away from the battle line and fled toward Egypt. Antony, seeing his lover's ships disappearing over the horizon, made a decision that would echo through history. He abandoned his own fleet and followed her. Picture this scene. You're a sailor on one of Antony's ships, fighting desperately against Octavian's forces, when you see your commander's ship suddenly turn around and sail away. The psychological impact was devastating. Without their leader, Antony's remaining forces either surrendered or were destroyed. But here's what makes Actium truly significant. It wasn't just about who controlled Rome. This battle determined what kind of civilization would emerge from the Roman Republic's ashes. If Antony had won, we might have seen a Hellenistic Egyptian-style monarchy, with rulers who claimed to be gods, and a capital that moved between Rome and Alexandria. Instead, Octavian's victory ensured that Roman culture, Roman law, and Roman values would dominate the Mediterranean world. Octavian returned to Rome not just as a victorious general, but as the sole master of the Roman world. The Senate, learning from their mistake with Caesar, didn't try to stop him. Instead, they granted him unprecedented powers and the title Augustus, meaning the revered one. The Roman Republic was dead, and the Roman Empire was born. Augustus's victory at Actium created what historians call the Pax Romana, 2 centuries of relative peace that allowed Roman civilization to flourish. Roads, aqueducts, amphitheaters, and basilicas spread across 3 continents. Roman law became the foundation for legal systems that still exist today. Latin evolved into the Romance languages that 500 million people speak. But every empire has limits, and Rome was about to discover theirs in the most brutal way possible. Augustus's ambition to expand the empire beyond the Rhine River would lead to our next battle, a disaster so complete it would haunt Roman nightmares for generations and permanently alter the empire's destiny. Battle 3, the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, 9 CE, the limits of empire. Imagine you're Augustus, the first Roman emperor, sitting in your palace in Rome in the year 8 CE. You've just received reports from your governor in Germania, Publius Quinctilius Varus, that the Germanic tribes are finally becoming civilized. They're paying taxes, adopting Roman customs, and some are even serving as auxiliary troops in your legions. Everything seems to be going according to plan for extending the empire to the Elbe River. What you don't know is that you're about to lose 3 entire legions in what will become Rome's most catastrophic military defeat. Varus wasn't a military man. He was an administrator, the kind of guy you'd send to organize tax collection or manage a peaceful province. Augustus chose him for Germania precisely because the region seemed pacified. This was like appointing an accountant to command special forces because you thought the war was over. Varus had about 25,000 men under his command, 3 full legions plus auxiliary forces, engineers, and camp followers. But the Germans hadn't actually been pacified. They'd been planning. Leading this conspiracy was a young Germanic chieftain named Arminius, who had actually served in the Roman army and held Roman citizenship. Think of him as the ancient world's version of a double agent. Arminius understood Roman tactics, Roman weaknesses, and most importantly, Roman arrogance. He knew that Romans believed their military superiority was so overwhelming that they'd grown careless. In September of 9 CE, Arminius approached Varus with reports of a distant tribal rebellion that needed Roman intervention. It was the perfect bait, a chance for Varus to demonstrate Roman authority while gaining glory and loot. Varus fell for it completely, ordering his 3 legions to march through the Teutoburg forest to suppress this fictional uprising. Now here's something modern people need to understand about ancient forests. They weren't like today's managed woodlands with hiking trails and visitor centers. The Teutoburg forest was a dark, primal wilderness where the trees grew so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground. There were no roads, no clearings, just narrow paths that wound between massive oak and beech trees. For a Roman army accustomed to fighting in open terrain with precise formations, this was like asking a NASCAR driver to race through a maze blindfolded. Varus's columns stretched for miles. Legionaries, baggage wagons, civilians, livestock, all strung out in a vulnerable line along forest paths barely wide enough for a single cart. The Romans couldn't use their famous turtle formation or coordinate their artillery. They couldn't even see more than a few yards in any direction. Arminius had spent months preparing the perfect killing ground. His warriors took positions throughout the forest, using the terrain like a natural fortress. When the trap was sprung, it wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. Germanic warriors attacked from all directions, appearing from behind trees, dropping from branches, rising from concealed pits. The Romans couldn't form battle lines, couldn't retreat in order, couldn't even identify where the attacks were coming from. For 3 days, Varus's army was systematically destroyed in running battles through the forest. The legionaries, trained to fight as a unit, were broken into small groups that were picked off one by one. Their armor, which protected them in open battle, became a liability in the thick woods where mobility was everything. Imagine trying to run a marathon while wearing a full suit of armor in a jungle where your enemies can shoot you from the trees. By the end, fewer than 1,000 Romans escaped to tell the tale. 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, were completely annihilated. Varus, realizing the magnitude of the disaster, committed suicide rather than face capture. The Germanic tribes displayed Roman skulls in sacred groves and used Roman armor as religious offerings. For years afterward, travelers in the region reported seeing the bones of Roman soldiers still scattered among the trees. When news reached Augustus in Rome, the emperor was devastated. According to the historian Suetonius, Augustus would wander his palace at night, beating his head against walls and crying out, "Varus, give me back my legions." The numbers 17, 18, and 19 were never used for Roman legions again. They were considered cursed, but the real significance of Teutoburg Forest wasn't just the military loss. It fundamentally changed Roman strategy. Augustus abandoned all plans to conquer Germania beyond the Rhine. Instead of pushing the frontier to the Elbe River, as originally planned, Rome established the Rhine as a permanent border. This decision would shape European history for the next 1,000 years. Think about what this meant. If Rome had successfully conquered Germania, there might never have been a Holy Roman Empire. No distinct German culture, no Gothic invasions of later Roman history. The failure at Teutoburg Forest preserved Germanic independence and created the cultural divide between Romance-speaking and Germanic-speaking Europe that still exists today. Rome's defeat also established a dangerous precedent. The empire could be stopped. For the first time since the early Republic, Rome had suffered a defeat so complete that it permanently altered imperial policy. This lesson wouldn't be lost on other barbarian tribes who would spend the next 4 centuries testing Roman resolve. Our next battle would show that even at the height of its power, Rome's strength depended on more than just military might. It required unity, and when that unity fractured, even the mightiest empire could tear itself apart. Battle 4. The Battle of Cannae, 216 BCE, Rome's greatest test. Now we need to step back in time to one of the darkest days in Roman history, when the Republic faced an enemy so brilliant that his name still makes military commanders nervous over 2,000 years later. This is the story of how Hannibal Barca brought Rome to its knees, and how a single day's fighting nearly ended Roman civilization before it truly began. By 216 BCE, Rome was already the dominant power in Italy, but it wasn't yet an empire. It was still a republic of city-states, trying to expand beyond the peninsula. Their main rival was Carthage, a wealthy trading empire based in modern-day Tunisia. Think of this as the ancient world's version of a trade war that got violently out of hand. Both powers wanted to control the lucrative Mediterranean trade routes, and both were too proud to back down. The Second Punic War had been raging for 3 years when Hannibal did something that everyone said was impossible. He marched an army from Spain over the Alps and into Italy itself. This wasn't just a military campaign, it was like a fantasy novel come to life. Hannibal brought elephants, cavalry, and African warriors into the Italian countryside, turning Rome's backyard into a battlefield. For 2 years, Hannibal had been making the Romans look like amateurs. He'd won victories at Trebia and Lake Trasimene, using tactics that the rigid Roman military system couldn't counter. Roman commanders were getting desperate, and desperate people make stupid decisions. The Romans decided to end this war with one massive, decisive battle. They assembled the largest army in their history, 8 legions totaling about 86,000 men. To put this in perspective, most Roman battles involved 20,000 to 30,000 soldiers total. This was like bringing a cannon to a knife fight, except the guy with the knife turned out to be a master strategist. Hannibal had only about 50,000 men, but he had something the Romans lacked: tactical genius. While the Romans were planning to crush him through sheer numbers, Hannibal was planning to turn their strength into weakness. The battle took place near the town of Cannae in southeastern Italy, on a flat plain that seemed perfect for the kind of straightforward clash the Romans preferred. The Roman plan was beautifully simple: form up in their traditional formation and steamroll right through the center of Hannibal's line. It was like planning to win at chess by capturing all the pawns with your queen. Hannibal's plan was far more sophisticated. He arranged his weakest troops, Gauls and Spanish infantry, in the center of his line, deliberately making them his most vulnerable point. His best troops, African heavy infantry, were positioned on the flanks. His cavalry, which was superior to Rome's, guarded the wings. When the battle began, everything went according to the Roman plan. At first, their massive formation crashed into Hannibal's center and began pushing it back. Roman commanders were probably congratulating themselves as they watched the enemy line bend and retreat. They were walking straight into the most perfectly executed trap in military history. As the Romans pushed deeper into Hannibal's retreating center, something catastrophic happened. The African heavy infantry on the flanks wheeled inward, attacking the Roman army from both sides. Simultaneously, Hannibal's cavalry completed their route too of the Roman horsemen and struck the Romans from behind. In military terms, this is called a double envelopment, but it's better known by its nickname, a Cannae maneuver. The Romans suddenly found themselves surrounded on all sides, packed so tightly together that they couldn't use their weapons effectively. It was like being caught in the world's deadliest mosh pit. What had started as an orderly advance became a massacre. Roman soldiers were crushed against each other, stabbed by enemies they couldn't see, trampled by their own comrades trying to escape. The slaughter was unprecedented. In a single afternoon, Rome lost approximately 70,000 soldiers, including 80 senators, numerous knights, and both consuls who commanded the army. To understand the scale of this disaster, imagine if the United States lost its entire Congress, most of its generals, and a significant portion of its military in one battle. That's what Cannae meant to Rome. News of the defeat caused panic in Rome itself. Citizens began fleeing the city, sure that Hannibal would march on the capital immediately. The Senate declared a state of emergency and began discussing surrender terms. For a moment, it seemed like the Roman Republic would end, just as it was beginning to reach greatness. But here's where the Roman character showed itself. Instead of surrendering, Rome did something that still amazes historians. They refused to give up. When Hannibal sent emissaries to discuss ransom for Roman prisoners, the Senate rejected them. When allied cities began defecting to Carthage, Rome raised new legions from teenagers and old men. They even freed slaves to serve in their armies, something unthinkable in normal circumstances. The Roman response to Cannae established a pattern that would define the empire for centuries. When faced with existential threats, Romans became more Roman, not less. They doubled down on their values, their institutions, and their determination to survive. More importantly, the Romans learned from Cannae. They studied Hannibal's tactics, adapted their strategy, and eventually found commanders like Scipio Africanus, who could beat Carthage at its own game. The lessons learned from this defeat would make Rome's military machine more flexible, more creative, and ultimately more successful. Cannae was Rome's greatest defeat, but it was also the making of Roman character. It taught Romans that survival required not just strength, but adaptability, persistence, and the willingness to reinvent themselves when necessary. These lessons would serve them well as they built an empire, but they would need to remember them centuries later when facing the final battle that would determine whether that empire would survive. Battle 5, the Battle of Adrianople, 378 CE, the beginning of the end. Our final battle takes us to 378 CE, when the Roman Empire was already ancient by its own standards. Augustus had been dead for over 350 years. Latin had evolved into different languages across the provinces, and Christianity had replaced the old gods. But Rome endured. Still the master of the Mediterranean world, what the Romans didn't realize was that they were about to face a new kind of enemy, one that would expose fatal weaknesses in their centuries-old military system. The Goths weren't like previous barbarian enemies. These weren't primitive tribesmen with crude weapons and no organization. They were a displaced people. Climate change and pressure from the Huns had forced entire Gothic nations to abandon their homes and seek new lands. Picture this as an ancient refugee crisis, except the refugees were warriors who had learned Roman tactics from serving as mercenaries in Roman armies. In 376 CE, thousands of Gothic families arrived at the Danube River, begging permission to cross into Roman territory. Emperor Valens faced a difficult decision. These weren't just warriors. They were entire communities with women, children, elderly, and livestock. Turning them away might mean war, but letting them in meant settling potential enemies within Roman borders. Valens chose what seemed like the clever solution. He'd allow the Goths to settle in Thrace, modern Bulgaria, as foederati, allied troops who would defend Roman frontiers in exchange for land and supplies. It was like offering citizenship in exchange for military service, a policy that had worked for centuries. What could go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. Roman officials assigned to manage the Gothic settlement were corrupt and incompetent. Instead of providing promised supplies, they sold Gothic children into slavery in exchange for food. They charged extortionate prices for basic necessities. They treated these proud warriors like conquered peoples rather than allied soldiers. The Goths endured this treatment for 2 years before finally reaching their breaking point. In 378, they rose in rebellion under leaders like Fritigern, sweeping across Thrace and destroying Roman settlements. This wasn't a typical barbarian raid. This was a coordinated uprising by people who understood Roman weaknesses because they'd been living within Roman territory. Emperor Valens decided to handle this crisis personally. He assembled an army and marched from Constantinople to crush the Gothic rebellion before it could spread. Valens was confident. After all, Roman legions had been defeating barbarian armies for 7 centuries. How dangerous could these Gothic refugees really be? The armies met near Adrianople, modern Edirne in Turkey, on August 9th, 378 CE. What happened next would shatter the Roman military system that had dominated the Mediterranean since the time of Caesar. The Romans approached the Gothic army in traditional formation, infantry in the center, cavalry on the flanks, everything organized in the disciplined ranks that had won 1,000 battles. But when they attacked the Gothic wagon circle, called a lugger, they discovered that their enemies weren't fighting like typical barbarians. The Goths had learned from centuries of contact with Rome. They'd studied Roman tactics, understood Roman equipment, and most importantly, they'd figured out how to counter Roman advantages. When the Roman infantry advanced, they found themselves facing not undisciplined barbarian charges, but coordinated defensive fighting from behind prepared positions. Then disaster struck the Roman flanks. Gothic cavalry, which had been away foraging, returned to the battlefield at exactly the right moment and smashed into the Roman cavalry. The Roman horsemen, already struggling against determined Gothic resistance, broke and fled. This exposed the flanks of the Roman infantry, who suddenly found themselves surrounded. What followed was eerily similar to Cannae, but with a crucial difference. This time, Rome was the victim of superior tactics rather than the beneficiary. Roman soldiers found themselves packed together, unable to maneuver, being cut down by enemies who fought with Roman weapons and Roman tactical knowledge. Emperor Valens himself was killed in the fighting, the first Roman emperor to die in battle against barbarians since the early Republic. When his body was finally found, it took time to identify him because he'd been stripped of the imperial regalia that marked his rank. 2/3 of the Roman army was destroyed, including most of its experienced officers and elite units. The psychological impact of Adrianople was devastating. For the first time in centuries, barbarians had defeated a Roman army using Roman methods. The myth of Roman military invincibility was shattered. More importantly, the battle demonstrated that Rome's traditional advantages, superior organization, better equipment, professional training, were no longer decisive when facing enemies who had learned Roman methods. But Adrianople's real significance was strategic. The defeat left the Eastern Roman Empire unable to control the Danube frontier. Gothic tribes, emboldened by their victory, poured across Roman borders. Other barbarian groups, seeing Roman weakness, began their own invasions. The great migrations that would reshape Europe had begun. Rome would never fully recover from Adrianople. The Western Empire would struggle for another century before finally collapsing in 476 CE. The Eastern Empire, Byzantine Empire, would survive for another 1,000 years, but it would do so by abandoning traditional Roman military methods and adapting to a world where Romans were no longer automatically superior to their enemies. The battle marked the end of the ancient world and the beginning of the medieval period. The Europe that emerged from the ruins of the Western Roman Empire was fundamentally different. Germanic kingdoms replaced Roman provinces, feudalism replaced imperial administration, and Latin evolved into the various Romance languages we know today. Conclusion: 5 battles that determined the future of the Western world. These 5 battles span nearly 500 years of Roman history, from the Republic's expansion in Gaul to the Empire's struggle for survival against Gothic invasions. Each battle didn't just determine who won or lost a particular conflict, they shaped the trajectory of Western civilization itself. Alesia showed how Roman engineering and persistence could overcome any natural advantage. Actium established the imperial system that would govern the Mediterranean world for centuries. Teutoburg Forest proved that even Rome had limits and established the cultural boundaries that still define Europe today. Cannae tested Roman character and forged the resilience that would build an empire. And Adrianople demonstrated that no empire, no matter how powerful, lasts forever. Together, these battles tell the story of Rome's rise and fall. But more than that, they show us how military conflicts can reshape entire civilizations. Every time you see a road, a legal system, or hear a Romance language, you're witnessing the legacy of these ancient battlefields where the fate of the world was decided by the clash of bronze and steel. If you like this video, then please hit the like and subscribe buttons now. That way you'll never miss another episode of Ancient Rome Revisited. And if you're a real history buff and love learning about life in the Roman army, then here is another video that explores a day in the life of a Roman gladiator. This video will walk you through what it was like to be a Roman gladiator, including what they ate to fuel their brutal life, their living quarters, and the hardcore training regime they had to follow. The video finishes by looking at some of the most famous gladiators, one of whom I'm sure you will have heard of before. I look forward to seeing you in the next video.